The Instronaut. Joe. Later that night, Joe came into work 15 minutes early, and he settled down with a nice steaming cup of hot coffee. But before he sat, he opened his locker, took out his uniform, put it on, then sat down and began to drink. After he had finished his beverage, he went into the kiosk and clocked in. Tim, the shift worker that was before him, said goodnight, clocked out, then left. After that he made his way to the local pub, because he said that he wanted a pint before making his way home. The car park was empty again, and so Joe locked up his kiosk, made his way to the back room, and made another cup of coffee. As the kettle was boiling, he unlocked his locker, took out the diary and put it on the table by the window. He finished making his drink. Then he settled down and made himself comfortable on his office chair with his book in one hand and his coffee in the other, and he began to read. My name is Lewes, and I would like to use my entries in this diary to show you my inner journey with the use of salvia, as I search to see that, if psychedelics are just plain hallucinations, or a gateway to alternate dimensions, other selves, the higher self, or God consciousness. Let's now take a brief look at Alan Watts' philosophy to put us in the right mood before we begin with the entries below. In the Eastern theosophies, like the Hindu, Buddhist and Taoist, they do not recognize the ego, or the unconscious. For them everything is God. When we wave our hands in front of our eyes, according to Alan Watts, this is an illusion, because we are really seeing it with our neurons, and just like the eyes create the illusion of where we are seeing from, so it is then for the brain when one is looking out. There is no self-looking out. We are just action-reaction habit-forming automatons firing chemicals as a reflex in response to our environment. We may appear to have a self looking out, but just like the eyes see from their perspective, creating a false impression of us seeing. This is the same for the neurons. We simply create our minds, our day-to-day lives, and personal agendas from our habits, genetic codes and emotions that in turn come from the source and were created by God. Alan also says that, if you take a bucket of ink, and tip it in a bath full of water, that you will get a chaotic mess in the bathtub, and this is like the universe is in creation. Essentially, he says that, if one looks at the ink in the bath, that one can, after looking at it for a while, begin to see patterns. Then one creates order out of the chaos, which is what we do with the universe. We gaze at the planets and the stars, we reflect, and we get constellations, solar systems and galaxies. Further, with symmetry and repetition, we get the space-time continuum. He goes on to say that we get so caught up with the naming of things, and that we must surpass this habit to achieve enlightenment. Primarily, we have no ego or soul, as this is a fantasy, for in reality, we are an extension of God. Our self is a delusion, and the other, which is the physical world, or the universe, is also an illusion. Nothing is real, just God, which is a transpersonal entity that completes us when we are absorbed, when we have balanced our karma and reached nirvana. When Alan spoke about LSD and Eastern mysticism, he said that it was stated that the reason why they demonized psychedelics in the 1960s in the West was because they were frightened of all the horrors that could emerge into the consciousness from the unconscious mind with the drugs consumption. Whereas in reality, it would be that the Eastern beliefs and cultures that psychedelic usage attracts could influence the young Western minds into Eastern theosophies with its own values on social, psychological, and spiritual disciplines intact. In the East, they don't believe in the unconscious. They don't have bad trips, just a oneness, or a connection, or gateway to the Supreme Being. However, this kind of thinking would put all the Western psychologists out of work, for there would be no need for their psychobabble. or the doctor prescribing endless supplies of prescriptive medicinal drugs, which only chemically represses the symptoms, not rid one of all their problems. On the whole, they just want to make money out of the needy for both the pharmaceutical industries and for themselves, and it's money that rules the world. So psychedelics were demonized and made illegal by law. Although, recently in the West, there have been studies using psilocybin, magic mushrooms, that have been carried out in laboratories to help eradicate alcohol addiction, cure cancer, or heal psychological problems. They are using psilocybin because it's milder than LSD, so the patients do not become horror victims or scapegoats like their predecessors did back in the 1960s. Salvia is a psychedelic mint from Mexico that has been used in medicinal practices for centuries to treat diarrhea, headaches, rheumatism, and anemia. However, I am into salvia as a gateway to altered states, or union with God, not its medical achievements. Basically, for centuries the Mazatek shamans have used salvia for divinatory purposes by attaining and utilizing visions that were brought back from their trips for religious inspiration and spiritual guidance, and this is what I want to do in my entries below. So let us see if I can achieve this goal in my subsequent entries. Trip 1. The time was 17:30 hours as I began to inhale the salvia extract. I felt the effects coming on gently, and it reminded me of the anesthetic that one gets given in a hospital. I placed the used pipe on a silver tray that was on a table that I had positioned alongside me at a safe distance, and then I drifted into an altered state. After a short unconscious patch, I heard a female voice question her superior in a local accent. I live in the southeast of England. She said, "What do you mean he ain't fallen?" Her accent and her slang sounded familiar, like of my elder sister Rose. I thought that I had come to from an accident, and that I was being placed in a hospital ward. I instantly thought that I had fallen from my building, and I was disorientated, terror-stricken, and I panicked. Then what I took as the doctor or superior said, "Place him over there." And I had the feeling that I had not fallen quite as far as I thought, so I was not in such a critical state as I had first feared or suspected. She replied to the doctor with one simple word, "Oh." But you could hear the surprise that she had mistaken me for a more critical case, and she was still bewildered that I wasn't, which meant that I looked either worse for wear, or she hadn't experienced this kind of situation before. Perhaps she was a student nurse, or a temp, or that not many people have made the trip biochemically lately. Nonetheless, she followed his orders, as she did what the doctor ordered by placing me in a ward for the less serious cases, which confirmed my feelings of his authority. It was then that I tried to sit up and look at the damage to my body, which took me back to when I had broken my legs when I was 18, and I had been in a motorbike accident when I was working as a dispatch rider that delivered direct from the warehouse to the garage, and I had also experienced it in the past with hospital operations. Again, I began to panic, as I did not wish to be in this place. I had completely forgotten that I had taken the salvia, and I was sure that I had had an accident, and I twisted and turned and was disorientated. I remember thinking, well, at least it is not that serious, and also fearing the pain that was to come with the healing of all my shattered limbs. Then, I panicked, twisted and turned as I tried to get a good look at my broken legs. Then suddenly out of nowhere there were two ethereal care workers who seemingly teleported into the room and stood at my side. They performed hands-on healing, and they proceeded to calm me down with their soothing words and encouragement, which came through telepathically that I was okay, and that everything was going to be alright. I suddenly felt a tranquil feeling permeate my entire being, and I changed my position to a southeasterly stance in search of my lucidity. I grabbed a cushion for comfort, and I saw my bookcase full of books, and it was then that I became bewildered about where I actually was. My rationale began to function, and I started to tell myself that, if I could see my books in my room, that I could not be in a hospital ward. Further, I told myself that nobody knew of my experiment, and if I had been injured that no one else would know. I pulled myself up, took my shirt off, because I was covered in a cold sweat, and had a sip from a glass of peach juice that I had prepared before my inner journey. After that I checked my pipe to make sure that it was safe where I had placed it on the silver tray on the table next to the sofa bed, and it was. Although I saw that it was where I had placed it, I needed to check it several times to grasp that it was truly safe. A moment went by, then I got up, walked into my bedroom, got undressed, turned on my halogen heater, and got straight into bed, for I knew that I was traumatized and in a state of shock. So I decided to lay into a fetal position and closed my eyes until all the side effects passed. I looked at the clock and it was 17:45 hours on the display. I lay there for a moment, and the shock passed almost instantaneously. So I got up and went into the other room, and I checked the time on the digital clock, and it was 17:52 hours. I did not expect this kind of experience. I was expecting a connection to my higher self, or God consciousness, or an out-of-the-body experience. The latter of which I am somewhat experienced, because I quite often find myself out of my body and floating about with the feelings of both clarity and euphoria, or I find myself on the astral planes, like Jon. However, the experience that I had was more like what I have read about in near-death experiences, but I did not lift up and rip out of my body and look down at my unconscious form with an elevated feeling of both joy and bliss, just like what Jon himself had experienced. I went inside my mind and arrived instantly at an alternate dimension, or a clinical destination, and was disorientated and terrified. The similarities of my sister and the nurse were uncanny, e.g. my sister uses local slang with a similar accent, and she works in a nursing home. I think that when I heard the voices that I not only heard them aloud, but also telepathically, hence the familiarity, which I took for my sister, because I had no vision, just some kind of spirit visualization. How could I know that she was a nurse in a hospital without my sight? I also feel that I was prematurely projected to the dormitory that is in spirit, or the afterlife at the way station in between life and death. Although the nurse was confused, the doctor was not, and he, or perhaps someone else that I was not aware of, and was present, summoned the other two care workers who certainly knew what they were doing when they healed my legs with their healing hands and their positivity. The two care workers, on further reflection, could be likened to spiritual doctors cum counselors, for they were kind and patient when they were trying to orientate me. However, it being my first voyage, and my confusion about the nurse's question of, "What do you mean he ain't fallen?" sent me avalanching, and all that I could do was hastily return to my conscious state. I think that the difference between the two hospital wards were that one was an orientation chamber for the deceased, perhaps a place where they place sudden deaths, or suicides that come with accidents, or overdoses, and the other one was for people in a comatose, or drug-induced state. The doctor and the two spiritual care workers were experienced, not omniscient, and this clearly shows that there is a progression in knowledge and wisdom within the light that is structured on one's merit. On top of this, that I arrived unannounced, or unexpected, and that the nurse was confused and the doctor suddenly decided from his experience where to place me indicates that his position of authority was one gained through his training and wisdom and all of his hard work. Further, if I have a personal guide, where were they when I went into the transitory stage? And why did they not inform the other world that I was coming, so that they could be ready and organized for my arrival? Another thing that startled me is that all the people present seemed so human until the care workers arrived, and this made me think that I had ended up in a hospital and not some kind of ethereal dimension. Maybe my guide was present, and it was they who called for the assistance of the two care workers, and not some kind of spiritual overlord that I presumed to be there at the time. The time is now 21:18 hours, and although I have remained conscious, time has seemed to travel subjectively at a greater speed, for I burnt my dinner, and my coffee got cold twice before I was able to drink it. I say twice, for I heated it up in the microwave to rectify the situation. I think that it is not as if time has subjectively changed its perpetual motion, like when one waits for a kettle to boil. It is probably down to short-term memory loss, because along with forgetting what to do, I have been getting lost in getting lost. Anyway, back to the trip. In the past, when I have awoken from my unconsciousness without a dream, I have always been disorientated as I awoke, like one experiences at the dentist or hospital when they come out of the anesthetic. Whereas this time, I was semi-conscious and disorientated throughout. When I was under and when I awoke, I was able to recall all the events, like one gets when one astral travels, or has a near-death experience. Basically, the other times in my life that I have either passed out or become unconscious, and there are quite a few that I can remember, all had one thing in common, and that was that I was not conscious when under. Whereas this time, I was conscious and confused throughout the entirety of the experience. And this leaves me wondering if I were dreaming and in my unconscious, or if the salvia had transported me to a dormitory within spirit, where one would usually recall and orientate the self from their past karma and all the confusion from the crossing, which in hindsight was the perfect place. So maybe Jon was right when he said that our state of mind connects, guides us to the appropriate place within spirit. So I will be able to reach a desired location with this in mind when on future trips. Trip 2. I have administered the salvia, and the time is 1:45 hours. I have decided to do it this time in a natural setting, so I am in my bedroom where I sleep at nights, instead of in my sitting room on the sofa bed. Again, I was convinced that I had fallen, and was in a critical condition, and like the last time, I could not feel my body. I recalled my first experience that I had before where I was in hospital, and that I was in this very same position once more. There was a feeling of helplessness, with a distinct feeling of having absolutely no control, and there seemed to be a horde of people gathered around my shattered body that is on the ground. There was a buzzing sensation throughout my whole being, and it felt like I was plummeting towards the ground. I suddenly got the image of being at school in the playground, and there were teachers and dinner ladies present. No one knew quite what to do, and I heard a man's voice stating the obvious. He seemed to have a Cockney accent, and it was high in pitch. Suddenly, the man's voice became many. It was as if his voice had an effects unit attached to it, like singers use to get several octaves to harmonize simultaneously. Then, there were several people all stating the obvious, that I had fallen, and that no one knew quite what to do, except repeat their confusion at the same time giving their account. They were convincing me that what they say had happened had happened. I cannot see the crowd in the usual perceptive sense. I see them with my sixth sense, or spiritual eyes. The experience seemed completely real, but because I had remembered my first experience from my first trip, and had given it some reflection, I was, as I had expected, able to carry it over into my second trip, and with it came the knowledge of what I was experiencing was an illusion. As I had the recall of the first trip, I was inundated with the thoughts of, why was I doing this to myself again, rushing through my head. After that, I gathered my inner strength, and said to the crowd that I did not care how convincing that all this actually seemed, that I knew I was tripped out, and I was comfortable in the luxuriousness of my bed. The voices persisted, making me laugh at the satire of the situation, and when I began to laugh, the trip began to fade away, and I was back in my bed in my bedroom, left with the insatiable feeling of wanting more. I did not crave it like an addiction. It was more like half reading a good book, and not having enough time to finish it. So with this in mind, I decided to take some more salvia, and go in again. Trip 3. I ingested the herb at 1:30 hours, and I was shocked that 3/4 of an hour had passed since my first intake. I placed my pipe down safely next to my bed, and I felt the effects coming on once more. This time, there was no hysterical crowd trying to convince me that I belonged up the accident and emergency department at the hospital. However, I did get the distinct feeling that I was being watched somehow. So I called out with my mind that I wanted to see God, or to travel to an astral dimension, or even altered state of awareness, which was futile. So I come to the conclusion, like Jon had suggested, to not to try and take control of the situation, but to let the experience itself have control. Then suddenly I felt myself transmogrify, and I became a washing line. I was the line. The posts and the paving slabs beneath on the ground, and I felt as if I was the washing line that I used to see out of my sister's window in the Hollandian Council flats in the Brighton suburbs, just north of the city. And the feeling was surreal, and again I laughed at the satire, as I thought to myself, with a chuckle, that there was no washing hanging on my line. Next, I felt like my physical body was buried, or melded with the concrete slabs, and my face looking up and out at the horizon. I just stayed put, both mentally and physically, lapping up the experience with nothing added or taken away. After a while I came to. I looked at the time, and it was 2 hours, and it was then sat back and chilled to some trip hop before I went to sleep. The eviction. I slept like a baby all through the night, and for me that is rare. I eventually awoke from a strange dream about being in an apocalyptic situation in Bovendian that is situated in the northeast of Brighton. I was with a few old friends from my childhood that I rarely see, for I have lived in the town centre for 21 years now, ever since my ex-civil servant mother got me thrown out of her house for growing cannabis under a lean-to in the back garden. She had cut my plants down and hid them in the garden at the back of the shed in the morning when I was in bed asleep, where she had awoken me up bellowing at the top of her voice that I had poisoned her grandchildren. Apparently, there were traces of cannabis in her teapot that we had missed when we cleaned up after our small party, which consisted of Paul and Sue from London and my girlfriend and I, who were sleeping. Hearing that she had torn down my plants sent me in a rage, demanding that she give up its hiding place, and she eventually gave in, but not until I had trodden all over her tomato plants. So she went out and got a local policeman to punish me. She pleaded with him, saying that she did not want her job to find out, because she could face drastic punitive measures, and so they agreed that he would deal with the situation without paperwork or help from his colleagues at the station. However, I do not think that he was going to stick to that deal, for the first thing that he mouthed on his entry into the house was, "Where are your plants?" So I pointed out to the trampled tomato plants, and told him that they were my plants, of which he stated that he wanted to know of the whereabouts of my marijuana plants, and that my mother had told him everything, and so there was no use trying to denying it. At that, I simply opened the door, and pointed to the grassland that encircled our home and said, "They're up there." And I said that I would give him a clue of how to find them, telling him they were green. He replied with, that I had 10 minutes to gather my belongings, and vacate my home, or else I would be arrested and escorted to the station. I sarcastically bid farewell to my mother, and the policeman at the door. My suitcase was crammed packed with the grass, and all my smoking equipment, and I was knocking off pieces of solid from my teeth with my tongue for my girlfriend, and I had eaten a quart of Nepalese resin between us, so as to get rid of the evidence. Nonetheless, the policeman and my mother did not have a clue of what was in the suitcase, as I made my way past them out of the front door into the front garden. When I got to the bottom of the path, my friend Jerry pulled up in his car, and he asked me what the police were doing at my door. I gave him a brief account and asked if he would not mind putting the case in his car, and dropping it off at my girlfriend's house later that day, and as I said this I opened the suitcase displaying the grass and the utensils, and my friend went white as a sheet with the shock and horror of it all. In those days, just as there was 1 in 10 unemployed, so it was that only 1 in 10 of the population smoked marijuana in post-70s Britain, and my friend was one of the 9 that didn't. He asked me to shut it quickly before we got caught red-handed, and I did it with laughter. Later that day, he dropped it off at my girlfriend's parents' house in Hollingbury, which is a suburban district in the north of Brighton, which I was temporarily staying at until I had sorted out a place to live. I stayed at her mum's house for a few weeks, without her knowledge, without explaining to her the gravity of the situation, for I felt that the less that she knew the better that it would be for everyone concerned. Her mother was a bit loose in the head, for she smothered her children with too much love and attention along with her outrageous demands. So I was not looking forward to living in my temporary accommodation. As we entered the house, I went to the toilet, where I broke down into hysterical laughter at what had been happening, what was taking place, and about my precarious situation. When I moved out, my girlfriend decided to move out with me, and her mother followed us all the way to the bus stop screaming profanities at me, and begging her daughter not to leave home, but to leave me instead. All her children were amateur British chess champions, and they also had bundles of A-graded O-levels, and I in her eyes, with only 2 C.S.Es to my name, I was a dropout, a good-for-nothing loser from a council estate, and she was probably right from her perspective. Eventually, 2 years later, with my girlfriend, Susan being a 4-time British amateur chess champion, and a would-be amateur glamour model, her personality had been sculpture by the noradrenaline, and she became as unbearable as a crack addict, tripping out on narcissism and egomania, and our relationship eventually, or inevitably fell apart. I simply told her that there was no way 2 people could love one person romantically at the same time, and so because she could not get over herself there was no room for me, and with that our relationship went out like a light. Eventually, my mother and I made up, and we were able to move on from the episode, and we laughed about it over and over for many years. I paid her back though, by giving her a brownie, and later I caught her watching a program called One Man and His Dog, which was about sheepdogs doing tricks for their owners for points, medals and cups. This was after she had watched Top of the Pops, which was a popular chart music program on the television back in the day, and when I asked her why she was watching the aforementioned program, she looked up at me, and her countenance was awash with a Cheshire Cat's grin, as she replied by saying that, "It's something to watch, innit?" When she left her job in her later years, and the 1 in 10 had turned around and the one were now the people that didn't smoke pot, she apologized for my eviction. Of course, apart from that one time, she never partook in it herself, but she was up for it being legalized, and she often sent me newspaper clippings through the post relating to it, along with clippings on climate change and the effects of global warming. The dream and the analyses. Anyway, back to my dream. There I was in Bovendian, and the A-bomb was going to be dropped upon the avenue about 500 yards from where I was brought up, and I had to get away from the blast. Next, I found myself caught up in a tribal situation, and the tribe were malicious in their nature. My friend Eddie was with me. He was trying to chat up one of the tribe's women. He was a bit of a womanizer. Sex always dominated his mind. I called him over and told him that we had to get away for our own good. The tribe kept ambushing us to hinder our escape, and I took them out with martial arts. Then there came a moment where I was outnumbered 3 to 1, and they had knives. So I picked up a plank of wood to hold them back. I turned around and told my friend that he had to help, or we would be done for. As I said this, a tribe member threw a knife at him, and he died instantaneously. The gang stood around me with their weapons in hand, and I heard one of them mention that they were all one. I then began having a philosophical spiel on oneness and the interconnectedness of the whole universe, a subject that in the waking and dream worlds I do not value. I currently believe that God is not the universe, like the pantheists and the Theosophical Society believe. The universe is perhaps God's mind. Basically, God's mind is where the scientists hypothesize the superstrings to be, just beneath creation, their answer to the unified field theory, and all creation are manifestations of its imagination. Anyway, I played them along, having read all the garb of the pantheists, like St. Paul had done when he had beguiled those ancient Greeks by garbling their own mythologies and using it against them, that is written of in the New Testament. I told them that, if they gave me a knife, that, as we were brethren, that I would take my own life, saving them the guilt, and they agreed. But before they handed me the knife, they told me that their group leader was merciless and sadistic in the way he killed people. I had killed quite a few members of their tribe, and I think it was meant to bolster their own courage, and to scare me into not trying anything other than taking my life with their blade. You know, like when someone boasts of knowing an alpha male with a reputation to boost their own prestige. Therefore, when they gave me the knife, much to their dismay, I turned it on them by thrusting it forward into the man's heart that was opposite me. And as I withdrew the blade in one swift move, I brought the knife across at shoulder height, changing the position or grip of the knife, and slit the man's throat at the left of me. Then, to complete my moves, there was really only one maneuver left, as I turned the blade in my hand from a slashing grip by using my fingers and thumb in an anti-clockwise tactic, so that it was in a stabbing grip once more that was now pointing in the direction toward the man to my right. And bringing the blade across the widths of my shoulders, I plunged the knife into the final man's heart, to the right of me, arching down as I did. After that I awoke from the dream, satisfied that I had escaped. Now, from that dream I can clearly see that Eddie, who is my friend, who is going through a midlife crisis, and as I wrote, that he was infatuated with women, and he believed that he was God, because he had read the book God I Am, of which in the past he had borrowed from me. So this was a symbolic representation of my asking to see God, and that he was seducing the woman was his perverse nature of his midlife crises. And the knife being thrown was because I saw a bit of the Bodyguard movie the other night on the television. And it was the scene where Whitney's minder gets rattled with Kevin Costner, and Kevin uses his fighting skills to outmaneuver and humiliate his adversary, and to get the minder to stand down and follow orders. The scene where the minder was casually yielded when he was in a bad temper. And on the attack, and then, after he picked his knife up in frustration, Kevin threw a knife that he had been using to peel his fruit at the minder, and it stuck into the wall above his shoulder, which brought him to his senses. Eddie is big and clumsy, and his mind, as you may have guessed, is unstable. But he is lovable. And as with him thinking that he was God, I quite often said to him, "If you are God, make a new planet, or create an unseen flower, or something." As I tried to make light of the situation, because as I wrote above, I felt that it was my fault that he had the God complex, which he acquired from the aforementioned book I lent him. On top of that, I have had a knife lunged at my throat in the past by a drug pusher who wanted to build a reputation. And 2 years ago, an alpha female in need of a fix placed a knife at my throat as I went to take the rubbish out to the bins, which are situated in a car park in a quiet and dark area underneath the offices that were in my building. With the lady, I told her that the money she wanted was in my wallet, and that if she wanted it, that she would have to remove her grip and the knife from my throat. And after the third time of me telling her, she withdrew the blade and grip, which was holding my lapel, so that she had me in what could be called a scissor-type grip with her knife pressed against my throat. Then, I just acted on instinct and training, and I repressed the true gravity of the situation to get through it and survive. What I did was, as I brought my hand up to reach my wallet, that I said with my wit was in my chest pocket, which incidentally was a ploy. I touched her elbow, gyrated my hips to the right, and her body moved like that of a cog in a clock. She had the knife in her right hand, and as her body turned in this direction, this brought the knife at its polarity in the opposite position from my body. Next, I slipped my hand down the back of her shoulders, and then along her arm, and at the same time, I held her wrist to keep her in the desired position. And as I grasped the back of her other wrist, and shook the knife out of her hand, I rotated her body back, so that she was facing me once more, and I tripped her by stepping behind her, and leaning forward with my body, and I lowered her to the ground with a move that I learned from my judo lessons. After that, I sat on her like a school child in a playground fight, and shouted out for assistance. She was arrested, where eventually, when in court, she got 8 months. I thought at the time that my life was worth more than that, because if it were one of my neighbors, or someone from the local shops, or offices, that it probably would have been deadly. I suppose that when I made my statement, I did not seem that bothered. It was probably a mixture of noradrenaline and endorphins from my fighting technique, and my connection to the Wu Wei that calmed me. So perhaps I seemed blasé to the police, and they probably told the jury. Another time, I was in my mid-20s, when a mindless thug attacked me with a knife that he used to try to impress and steal my girlfriend. The bouncers stopped the knife fight with the hoodlum, for it was in a club, but not before the knife was placed at my exposed throat. But luckily the thug did not have the will or conviction to actually use it. Also in my mid-20s, I was on my way back to a friend's house with a few mates, where we were confronted by 2 Arabian men who were looking for trouble, and the leader tried to slash my stomach with a knife that he used in an upward arch from his waist to my stomach. I blocked his move in a downward 45-degree angled motion with my right arm. He dropped the knife from the downward force of my palm. I grabbed hold of his wrist, turned sideways, raised my leg, kicked him in the chest with a kung fu sidekick, and he went flying through the air and landed on his back. He scampered to his feet, grabbing his knife, as he did so and ran away as fast as his feet could muster. However, I was in hot pursuit, and totally sober, because up to that point I had been both drunk and stoned, for I had been at a lock-in at a pub in Queen's Road, which is the road that leads to Brighton train station from the city centre. At having nearly been gutted like a fish, I was, as I said, completely sober, and then I decided to pursue the assailant. I nearly caught him as I threw myself in the air in his direction in a rugby tackle, and I landed on my knee, and because of the intense pain I gave up the chase and went back to my mate's flat to party. Between trip 1 and 2, I did some research on the internet and read how they had tested salvia on rats and monkeys, and that there were no physical dangers to worry about, because after they had fed them the salvia, they had killed, dissected them and examined their remains. With the monkeys it was said that there is a dormant opiate receptor that gets activated with the drug's intake, and in humans it is the same. I also read where a man had a cosmic conscious experience, as he felt a oneness with the whole universe. This would relate to the tribe's belief. The apocalypse and Vivendian would relate to post-traumatic stress from both the salvia from the first trip, and to my personal history of me being thrown out of my home in my early 20s, and also of the realisms of growing up in the Cold War and the nuclear age in my youth, where we bottled it up, pushed it down and got on with our lives. The tribe from which we tried to escape would relate to the menacing crowd that was around me on the past trip, of which I had repressed, and the relative material from my youth that I have mentioned above. In addition, I think is due to me defeating post-school bullies, of which for a time right up until my late 20s led me on a crusade to attack every bully and liberate all the victims that fell into their cruel paths. That and having to fight instead of flight when I was a punk rocker growing up in the late 70s and early 80s, with all that battle on the beaches charade of which I was caught up in whenever I went out. But not out of choice, it was because of my dress sense that brought the attention of other cults that came with the release of the film Quadrophenia, which reflected the mods and rockers' aggressive culture. I remember the time when I first made my stand against bullies. It was when I was 17, and I was at a football match in League One between Brighton and Hove Albion and Manchester United at our home ground, the Goldstone in Hove. The opposing fans were running a riot in the streets outside after the game had finished, and my friend Mike and I were gingerly making our way through the maddening crowd to get to our motorbikes that we had parked in the back streets behind the stadium. When we were halfway there, a group of 3 Manchester United fans that were out of the view of the police and looking for violence decided to try and beat us up. One of them walked over to Mike and asked him in a northern accent, "Who do you support?" Of which he replied, "A," which mimicked his attacker, and the man of fan just stood there and glared at him, not knowing quite what to do at his utter cheek. His 2 friends came over to me and punched and kicked me simultaneously, so I fell upon the floor, then rolled up into a ball and covered my head with my arms for protection. After a while, I thought to myself, this is not hurting, and that I should get up and fight back, of which I did. At first they knocked me back into the bonnet of a car and proceeded to hit me, but I stood up, threw my arms down by my side, and I roared like a lion at that they stopped beating me, and they ran away in fear of my oncoming retaliation. Their friend, who was poised next to Mike, took one swipe at him, of which he yielded. And then he ran away frustrated. I say frustrated, because after he had run around the corner pursuing his friends, he came back with an empty milk bottle in his hand, which he intended to use as a weapon, but to his surprise I ran at him screaming with my fist in the air ready to attack him. Seeing my fury and intent, he dropped the bottle, turned around and he ran in the opposite direction. I did not chase after him. I simply stopped running, and Mike and I laughed as we made our way to our motorbikes. I think that the above violent confrontations have entered my dreams, and I think that the traumas have been released, and that like on the third trip everything should be benevolent from now on.